Good evening. How's everyone tonight? Terrific. I'm delighted to be here representing the Board of Directors for the Public Policy Institute of California. My name is Donna Lucas, and we are extremely pleased today to welcome U.S. Secretary of Education Arne Duncan. Mr. Secretary, welcome. Thank you for being here. I just wanted to note that this presentation today is part of the PPIC 2013 Speaker Series on California's future. And I'd like to thank those who have supported us in doing this. They include the Applied Materials Foundation, the California Endowment, the James Irvine Foundation, Nicholas Berggruen Institute of Governance, Pacific Life Foundation, S.D. Bechtel Jr. Foundation, Sierra Health Foundation, Southern California Edison, Stewart Foundation, Union Bank, the William and Flora Hewlett Foundation, and our knowledge partner, McKinsey & Company. This event is also being funded by the PPIC's Donor Circle, which I invite all of you to join. Before we begin, just two housekeeping items. First of all, before you leave today, please take a moment to fill out the confidential evaluation form on your chair. It really helps us in planning future events. The second thing is, please turn off your cell phones so we won't be interrupted during the program. Now on to the program, and it is truly my pleasure to introduce Maggie Weston, who is a PPIC researcher, and she is going to set the context of the discussion between Mark and the Secretary on education. So please join me in welcoming Maggie.
Thank you, Donna, and good evening, everyone. I'd like to just spend a few minutes providing some background and context for today's discussion with the Secretary. So California educates more than 6 million children in almost 10,000 public schools. And for most of their history, public schools were financed and regulated by their local communities. But starting in about the 1960s, a series of historic court cases, laws, and ballot measures shifted the burden of financing and regulating public schools to the state and federal government. Today, California public schools receive about 60% of their revenue from the state and about 10% from the federal government. The Elementary and Secondary Education Act of 1965 dramatically increased the federal role in financing and regulating public schools by providing funding for schools serving poor students. The ESEA was most recently authorized by the No Child Left Behind Act of 2001, which expanded the federal role even further by creating new testing, accountability, and school improvement requirements. Under NCLB, students are annually tested in reading and math in grades 3 through 8 and once in high school. The results of all students and certain demographic subgroups of students are made public. One of the main goals of NCLB was to eliminate the achievement gap. So by law, all students must be proficient in English and math by 2014. Schools that fail to make adequate progress towards that goal are labeled failing and are subject to various sanctions, including getting shut down. In 2012, 58% of California students were proficient in English language arts and 60% in math. Although the state has made significant progress over the last decade, with proficiency rates increasing by nearly 20 percentage points, we are still well below that target of 100% proficiency. Furthermore, the gap between Black and white students is nearly 30 percentage points and has only very narrowly decreased, or that gap has narrowed over time. Finally, despite this improvement in student outcomes, about 70% of our schools and half of our school districts are labeled failing under NCLB. Since its implementation, NCLB has been controversial. Critics often object to the potential for a narrowing of the curriculum or teaching to the test, the punitive sanctions, and the unrealistic goal of proficiency for all students by 2014. NCLB was due for reauthorization in 2007, yet little progress has been made, despite broad consensus that an overhaul is necessary. In the meantime, most states have escaped NCLB requirements through the U.S. Department of Education's waiver program. The waivers exempt states from specific NCLB requirements, including the one for 100% proficiency by 2014, in exchange for new state plans regarding accountability systems, teacher and principal evaluations, and college and career-ready standards. California submitted a request that was rejected because it failed to link teacher evaluations with student outcomes. Since then, a group of 9 districts, including Los Angeles Unified and other large urban districts, have submitted a separate waiver request, that's currently under review. California has, however, joined 44 states and the District of Columbia in adopting new academic content standards known as the Common Core State Standards. These standards are generally viewed as more rigorous, requiring higher order skills and critical thinking. California has joined a consortium of states to create new materials and assessments that will begin implementation in 2015. At the same time, the state has begun rethinking its own accountability system and what types of outcomes should be measured in the state's academic performance index. Right now, this measure only includes state tests, and some have called for it to include non-cognitive measures such as high school graduation rates and student attendance. Finally, just last week, the state legislature approved a major overhaul of our school finance system that provides more revenue to low-income students and English learners and permanently extends more local authority over revenues. So as you can see, there's a lot happening in school finance and governance here in California and across the nation. And I'd now like to invite Secretary Duncan and PPIC President Mark Baldassare to the stage to more fully explore these topics and the role of the federal government in education. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Maggie. That was a wonderful summary of the past 50 years of education history in the U.S. and California. And only you could do it in 5 minutes. So that was terrific. I'm Mark Baldassare, and it's just a privilege and a pleasure to have Secretary Duncan here today. We're just delighted that you could make it. All of you, I'm sure, are aware of Secretary Duncan's role and a little bit about his history. And the history of Secretary of Education. There have been 9 of them, but President Obama has only had 1, and it's been Secretary Duncan, who was nominated early on and who has taken that role and really provided a lot of energy and a lot of discussion and activity in education these last few years. So I'm really looking forward to this conversation today. Before Secretary Duncan went to Washington for between 2001 and 2008, he was the CEO of the Chicago Public Schools. So he comes to the position in Washington with a lot of experience at the local level as well. So that's terrific. And one of the things that I've learned in reading about all that you're doing is that you travel around the country a lot. And some say that next to the Secretary of State, you probably travel second most in terms of everybody on the cabinet. So we're delighted that you're out here in California today. And I wonder if we could start the conversation, since both from your vantage point in Washington and being around the country so much, talking to people in schools and education, higher education, as well as K through 12 and early learning. What do you see as the biggest challenges in education today?
We have no shortage of challenges, so I could give you a laundry list. I'll try and keep my answers short and really look forward to the conversation. Honestly, I think the biggest challenge in education is a sense of complacency around the country, whether it's from parents or from the broader community. It's really interesting when you poll parents, survey parents, the vast majority of parents say their school is fantastic and the rest of the nation's schools aren't. And that's actually impossible, but perception is reality. You watch the presidential debates, education virtually didn't come up in the presidential debate, something I think is so, from either side. And I think for us to get better faster, which we need to do, I just wish a lot more folks, regardless of politics and ideology, education should be the ultimate bipartisan, nonpartisan, non-ideological issue. I wish a lot more folks went to the voting booth asking the question, what is this politician going to do to invest in education and to help the United States regain its sort of world leadership? And we don't have that. And we have challenges. I always tell the story, South Korea is one of the countries that's out-educating us today. And when our President Obama, visited South Korea, met with the president, he always asked about education, said, what's your biggest challenge? And right away, the president of South Korea said, my parents are too demanding. And even my poorest parents demand a world-class education. And I have to spend millions of dollars a year to teach my kids English in first grade because my parents won't let me wait until second grade. I wish we had a lot more of that pressure. The biggest critique I always get is that I'm going too fast. I think we're all going too slow. I wish we had a lot more parents knocking down my door and the superintendent's door and the mayor's door and the governor's door saying, why aren't we getting better faster?
Have you been able to change the pace at all? I don't want to use a basketball analogy, especially with a basketball player, but you know, have you speeded up the game a little bit in the course of time?
We're absolutely trying to, and I think some, it's for other folks to decide. Some folks would say there's been an unprecedented, pace of change. There's also risks of going too fast, and sort of very cognizant of that as well. But from lots of different things, what we've tried to do, big increase in Pell Grants. Sure, we'll talk about the Common Core, higher standards, next generation of assessments, trying to do a lot more in the early childhood space. There's been a lot of movement in a short amount of time. But again, I think we have to keep figuring out how to accelerate the pace of change. And when we started 4 years ago, we had the Recovery Act and $100 billion for education. That was a pretty wonderful first couple months. But we're not going to see times like that again. So the question is, with limited resources, how do we keep getting smarter? How do we keep being more efficient and effective with the resources we have?
I was really interested to see the president come out earlier this year and say that expanding early education was going to be a priority, and you've been going around the country talking about it and building support around that. It's not the first time we've heard about the importance of preschool or early education, but I'd like to understand from your point of view why that's so important, and what are your thoughts about how we're going to pay for the roughly $75 billion, I think, that's being discussed as the price tag?
So I've never had a job before when I knew I was going to get fired. So I'm going to get fired in about 3 years, 6 months. So I spend a lot of my time thinking about what are those couple of things, 2 or 3 or 4 things we can do that changes education for the next couple of decades. If we try and do 20, we just perpetuate the status quo. And arguably at the top of that list, or in the top 2 or 3, for me, is dramatically expanding access to high-quality early childhood education. Just a couple quick facts, not to give you too many statistics, but less than 3 in 10 4-year-olds today have access to high-quality pre-K. The average child coming from a disadvantaged community starts kindergarten at 5 in the fall, a year to a year and a half behind. And then we wonder why we have achievement gaps. We wonder why we have dropout rates. And I'm just convinced we have to get out of the catch-up business. We have to give all of our babies a chance to enter kindergarten with their literacy and their socialization skills intact. So we're partnering very closely with Kathleen Sebelius and HHS. It's really a 0 to 5 continuum. She would focus much more on the 0 to 3 space and more home visiting and early Head Start. But the goal is to basically double, add another 1 million kids to high-quality pre-K. And not cheap. We proposed a pay-for of a cigarette tax, 94 cents per pack. Some folks love that, some folks don't. One of the benefits there is, because teens are so price conscious, estimates are an additional 233,000 fewer teenagers would start smoking, so some real health benefits there. Frankly, I'm agnostic. If someone has a better idea of how to pay for it, I'm more than open to it. We can't run up the deficit, so there has to be a pay-for. And what's so interesting to me is if you look at the longitudinal, the long-term data, 30, 40, 50 years, James Heckman and others, Nobel Prize-winning economists, he talks about a 7-to-1 return on investment, 7-to-1 ROI. Significant reductions in costs with less teenage pregnancy, less dropouts, less crime. People graduate from high school, they graduate from college, they go into the workforce. How many times do we get a 7-to-1 return on investment in the stock market? If you're doing that, let me know what you're buying. In the public sector, on our tax dollars, these are tough economic times. It's to ask anybody to pay more, that's a lot to do. But from an economic standpoint, it's the right thing. And it's fascinating. As I travel the country, we have many, many CEOs who are absolutely committed to this. It might be a little counterintuitive, but they get return on investment. We have military leaders backing this. You have attorney generals who know the reductions in crime was with the attorney general in Kentucky yesterday. Faith-based community, so you have some really interesting partners starting to come behind this. And the final thing I'll say is that it's become a bipartisan issue. So you have Republican and Democratic governors who, in tough economic times, many of whom are starting to invest and put scarce money behind this because they get it. So the question is, can we get a dysfunctional Washington to pay attention to the real leadership going on around the country? So I am traveling more than I like, but it's got to be, I think, an outside-in strategy. And Governor of Alabama, conservative Republican, Governor Bentley, he watched the President's State of the Union. He and I talked about it. He said, I was watching with my wife, and I told my wife, the President's stealing all my lines. And that was music to my ears. That was a great sign. So it's a battle, but it's a battle I desperately want to win. And again, if we can do this, I think we change education in this country for the next couple of decades.
Do you see this as something that might happen this year or next year, or what's your sense at this point, a few months out into it?
I don't have a clear sense of timing. I mean, this is clearly a heavy lift. There's nothing easy about raising $75 billion. But again, I'm going to work just as hard as I can and seeing, again, the real world, so many people coming together behind this. I don't have a clear sense of timing, but it's one that I'm not interested in symbolic victories. We want to get this.
Right.
We want to get this done, and I don't want to just do. Some people say, "Well, the governors are investing. Why do you need to do it?" I was in Georgia. They're doing some good things, but they have a waiting list of 8,000. So people are trying to do the right thing, but there's still, in virtually every state in the country, there's a long, long waiting list. So the question is, can we be a good partner? This wouldn't be a top-down federal mandate. We just simply want to invest with states that are themselves putting skin in the game and try and not just add a few more kids, but add another million children. The only way you do that is with a significant investment. You just sort of can't talk about that. You got to put money on the table.
I'd like to come back to the No Child Left Behind program, which Maggie nicely summarized. 2001, President Bush, Ted Kennedy launched the program. 2007 was time for reauthorization. It didn't get reauthorized. Congress is currently discussing it again. And I was reading some of the coverage of the discussions in the Senate right now about it, the Republican and Democratic discussions, and seems to be a lot of discussion around what the role of the federal government ought to be in education, which is generally something that occurs on the local level. The states have gotten more involved in it. How do you view the role of the federal government, and how does this relate to how you're approaching the reauthorization of No Child Left Behind?
It's something my team and I think about every day, and I'll be really clear. I came to Washington with a lot of skepticism about the federal government. In Chicago, I was not a big fan of No Child Left Behind, lived on the other side of the law, started my job there in 2001. Actually had to come to Washington to almost sue my Department of Education to give me the right to tutor 25,000 of my kids after school. And the Department of Education was saying I couldn't do it. It was absolutely insane. We won that battle, but I never had anyone from Washington calling saying, how can I help you reduce your dropout rate? And how can I help you get more kids in college? It's all about bureaucracy and compliance. So, but there's a very appropriate federal role and state role and local role. So to answer your question, what's the appropriate federal role? What I think No Child Left Behind got fundamentally wrong, and I just have a very different theory of action. No Child Left Behind was very, very loose on goals. So 50 different goalposts, many of which got dummied down in the states to make politicians look good. So loose on goals, but very tight, very prescriptive on how to hit those and telling exactly what to do. I just think that's absolutely backwards. So what I want to do is be tight on goals, high bar for everyone, college and career ready standards, internationally benchmarked, but be very loose, very flexible on how to get there. This is a big, big country. 50 states, rural, urban, suburban. To think that someone in Washington or myself can figure out the best way to educate kids around the country, to me that'd be the height of arrogance. So hold you accountable to high bar, but give you lots of room to be creative, to be innovative, to share best practices, and figure out how to get there. So that's what I want to flip. Tight on goals, loose on means. We want to continue to highlight best practices. We want to continue to build communities of practice. There's lots of great work going on. The problem in education never quite gets to scale. We can do that. And we've seen a huge amount of change, whether it's Race to the Top dollars or Invest in Innovation I3 dollars or Promise Neighborhood dollars, or we've done early childhood grants. I'm a big believer of where if we just come in and we're the whole game and there isn't local buy-in, that doesn't work. Where there's tremendous local buy-in and we're adding some resources to the great work that's already going on, that leverages everything that's going on and takes it to a different level. So finding, again, whether it's, you play at different levels, state level, district level, local community level, where you're seeing great work, can we invest dollars to, again, build proof points of what's possible and then hopefully take those to scale. The final thing I'll say, and I've tried to do this, is to just really tell the truth. Where things are going well, to highlight that. Where things aren't going well, to frankly challenge people. And I'm not politically correct, but I think far too often, again, we're just sort of, we're part of the problem. We're complacent. Yeah. And where there's great things going on, I want to do everything I can to put a spotlight on it. But where things aren't working well for kids, I think I have a moral obligation to be very clear about that as well.
A lot of discussion both in Washington and locally and in California around the waivers, the NCLB waivers. I know that you can't really talk much about what's going on in terms of those districts that have gotten together in California to apply themselves for a waiver that involves 1.2 million students. But can you at least give us a sense of what are some of the issues that need to be considered when you have not a state, but a group of districts within a state that are asking for an NCLB waiver?
Well, let me back up. My absolute plan A was to fix No Child Left Behind, and many things are broken, and fix it in a bipartisan way with Congress. And we spent a ton of time over the past 2 years working with folks, and Congress, unfortunately, is pretty broken these days and couldn't get it done. So we were very fortunate to have the ability to provide waivers. We've seen a huge interest around the country. We've provided 37, 38. We have about another 7, 8 states that we're looking at, again, across the political spectrum, from Massachusetts and Maryland to South Carolina and Alabama just today, actually. So for me, it's actually been an underreported story because there hasn't been a bunch of controversies. A lot of people working hard. One of the things that a couple of things I've loved about the waivers, one, and I didn't fully realize this, I don't know if anyone in the country realized this, there were literally hundreds of thousands of kids across the country under No Child Left Behind who were invisible, who weren't part of the accountability system. It gets a little technical, but because N sizes were relatively high, you had special needs kids, you had English language learners, you had black kids, you had brown kids, you had poor kids who just weren't in the accountability system. And in the waiver process, you've seen a huge number of states step up with tremendous courage and say, we're going to be held accountable for every single child there. I also didn't like at all with No Child Left Behind just to focus on one test score. It's all kinds of multiple problems with that. You've seen many states moving significantly away from an A test score, yes, looking at growth and gain and improvement, but a whole set of other metrics, accountability, looking at high school graduation rates, looking at reductions in dropout rates, looking at college going rates, looking at college perseverance rates, looking at going to college and not taking remedial classes. And I get critiqued some that it's more complicated. It's definitely a little more complicated. But for me, it's much more honest. It's much more holistic and comprehensive. And I always say if you have great third grade test scores and a 50% dropout rate, it's hard to get a good job with a third grade test score. But if those high school graduation rates are going up and dropout rates are going down, then that district, that school, or that district or that state, you can roll it all the way up, are showing real improvements. So huge amounts of creativity and courage coming from states. When Congress gets its act together, I desperately hope they don't just keep their heads down in Washington, but they take the best ideas from the best states, and that would be a really interesting reauthorization. My strong preference would have been to work with California as a state. Didn't quite work out. I've worked very closely with Governor Brown. He encouraged me to look at the core districts. You have some fantastic districts and superintendents, San Francisco here, LA, Long Beach, a bunch of educators who I have tremendous respect for. I can't comment on the details because, again, we're going back and forth, and ultimately I have to make a decision. But I just appreciate those 9 districts. I think you said 1.2 million children. That's 2 to 3 times some of the states that we've provided waivers to, Delaware, Rhode Island, other places. So there are a lot of children of color, a lot of children who don't come with a silver spoon in their mouth. And I think we have some really courageous superintendents who are trying to do the right thing. So we'll continue to work through the details and go back and forth. In an ideal world, it would work with California as a whole, but starting with 9 really important districts and 1.2 million kids. There are some challenges with doing it at the district level, not the state level. It's not a perfect world. But if we can provide a better education for over 1 million kids, I think we have to take a very serious look at that opportunity.
I don't know as much about what you're hearing from other states, but within our state, a big point of discussion was teacher evaluations and whether teacher evaluations ought to occur at the state or the local level. I wonder if you could comment on your thoughts about teacher evaluations.
And again, all this stuff, whether it's local or state, that's going to matter. That context is going to vary place by place. And again, California is bigger than lots of states put together, so I really get the idea of doing things at the local level. There are two extremes. In all these education debates, there's always extremes. I always think 99% of the time the extremes are wrong. I always think there's a common sense middle ground. So for the past 30, 40, 50 years, teacher evaluation and student achievement were divorced from one another. There was no correlation between whether students were actually learning and how teachers were evaluated. That, to me, demeans the profession. I think we know from lots of evidence, I think we know from our own lives, great teachers make a huge difference in children's lives. 3 great teachers in a row, and the average kid is 1.5 to 2 years ahead. 3 bad teachers in a row, and that kid is so far behind they may never catch up. So one extreme is having student performance, student growth divorced from teachers. The other extreme is where like 100% of a teacher's evaluation is based upon a test score. That makes no sense either. But I think there's a common sense middle ground where in teaching, like any other true profession, you look at multiple measures. And we just want one of those measures, one of multiple, to be are students improving or not. And again, looking at gifted, apples versus apples, gifted versus gifted, special ed versus special ed, are students improving? But you also have to look at peer review, you have to look at principal evaluation, you need to survey students. Kids know exactly who's having an impact in their lives and not. You can talk to parents, you can do a whole set of things. And so having student growth be a piece of that, and it's up to states to figure out how much, we thought was important. I actually use the California analogy, not in a good way as I travel the country, but my numbers might be a little bit off, but my understanding is there are about 300,000 teachers in California. It's pretty staggering. And so that, just ballpark numbers, top 10%, top 30,000 teachers in California are arguably amongst the best teachers in the world, literally world class. The bottom 10%, the bottom 30,000, maybe shouldn't be teaching, maybe should be doing something else. And no one in California that I've met, hopefully someone's here, no one can tell me who's in that top 10% and who's in that bottom 10%. And if you are building a true profession, whether it's in business or running a nonprofit or a law firm or you want to have some sense of who are your stars, who do you learn from, who should be mentoring the younger teachers, who should be the master teachers. And it is hard, it's controversial, I understand, it's scary. But I think, again, if we're going to really try and build a profession that values excellence and shines a spotlight and pay great teachers a lot more, and where we really support teachers to become world class, and where we have an honest conversation where it's simply not working to have teachers move on to do something else, having some sense of whether students are learning or not has to be a piece of that conversation.
I wonder if we could talk for a bit about the Common Core standards. A lot of excitement and enthusiasm about all the states that have taken it up. And I think now, in our state, one thing that Maggie didn't mention, but in the budget there was $1 billion.
$1.2
billion. Put $1 billion into getting ready for Common Core one-time expenditure. What do you think we can accomplish with Common Core standards that we haven't with other efforts to reduce the achievement gap and improve education? And what should a state like California be doing to get ready for the implementation of Common Core standards?
This is a really, really big deal. I think when the history of education is written, there's going to be a pretty big chapter.
And why is it such a big deal?
Again, you go back, and I'm not the historian, but I think it's honestly the first time in our nation's history where the vast majority, again, 45, 46 states, where the vast majority of kids in this country are going to be measured by a common yardstick. And a child in a high-performing state like Massachusetts or Maryland, or a child in a low-performing state like Mississippi, we're going to measure them the same way. And what has changed is the world has changed. And we're not competing for jobs in this community or in California, as large as it is, we're competing for jobs with children in India and China and Singapore and South Korea. And we owe it to our children, we owe it to our country to know whether our children are prepared for those high-skill, high-wage jobs and keep those jobs in this country, or those jobs are going to migrate to where the most educated workforce is. If folks haven't read the Common Core standards, take a glass of wine or 2 or 3 it might take, you might need, and just take a look. It's so interesting to me, there's lots of noise and drama and controversy. I just keep asking, have you actually looked at them? Have you read them? And then let's have an informed conversation. But the vast majority of states, California had relatively high standards, which was great, but for many states, the Common Core is a significant step up. And to give you one example, when Tennessee raised standards, my numbers won't be exact, Tennessee in like 4th grade math, I think it was math or reading, went from like 91% of kids proficient to 38% of kids proficient. In achievement gaps that were actually very large, literally doubled. What happened though is Tennessee, for the first time ever, was telling the truth. This is the truth, and we've been masking it because we dummied down standards to make politicians look good. And when we dummy down standards, who gets hurt the most? It's always the most disadvantaged kids. The high flyers are going to be fine, whatever the standards are. But it's the kids who we're lying to, telling them and their parents they're ready, and they're not, that we do just a tremendous disservice to. So this is a big, big step in the right direction and a profile of courage to have 46 states adopt standards. Now, higher standards. That's the easy part. The hard part is how do you implement? And to have the governor, in tough economic times, come up with $1 billion, I think it's just a fantastic move. As I travel the country, teachers almost universally really embrace, they like the Common Core, but it's also scary. And we need to help them prepare to teach to a much higher standard. We need to talk to parents about what's going to be expected of their children. We need to talk to kids themselves about what you did historically isn't quite good enough. The business community, the nonprofits, there has to be a public sort of conversation discourse here. But moving from adoption, which is great but easy, to implementation, which is going to be tough and complicated and messy, and some places are getting it right and some places are further behind, and we need to get to learn from each other. It's going to be a choppy year, 2, 3 years, but if we can get to the other side of it as a country, I think we would have taken a quantum leap in the right direction. But it's going to take time, it's going to take attention, it's going to take teachers, sharing with teachers. I'm not a big believer in professional development where you go to a lecture hall, you go to a hotel ballroom and sit and get. It's got to be sort of job embedded. What does this really mean? What are the benefits? A 5th grade math teacher, an 8th grade algebra teacher can now share ideas and best practices with their colleagues across the country. It's not just a local situation anymore. If you're the only physics teacher in a high school, we have many of those, it's hard to get PD in your school that's helping you get better. You can now work with your colleagues, obviously with technology and things that didn't exist a few years ago, to really challenge yourself to go to a different level. When you think about student mobility and how much our families are moving, to think about them going to different states and having different standards in other places, one of the biggest proponents of this are military families, because military families are, by definition, mobile. And I've heard just heartbreaking stories from parents where they think their kid's doing good and they move to the next state and they find out their kid's 2 years behind. It's not fair. So lots of tremendous hope here, but a heck of a lot of hard work. And again, there'll be bumps and rough patches, but we're all in this together. There's no competition. If a district or a state's doing better, let's learn from them. If a district or a state is struggling, let's get them the help they need as quickly as we can.
I wonder if we could talk about Race for the Top. Those dollars will run out one of these days. And as you mentioned in your introduction, it was a very significant investment made. I wonder, from your vantage point, can you tell us what you feel the lasting accomplishments of Race to the Top will be? How will this be looked upon 10 years from now? What will people say, these things happened to education?
It's been a fascinating lesson, and obviously one of the things that we incentivized was folks raising standards. And for me, it was not about common. Common's good. What's important is high. And we just wanted people not to dummy down standards. A number of lessons. One is it was a significant investment. The first tranche of Race to the Top, $4 billion. $4 billion is a lot of money. Sounds like a lot of money. To put it in context, though, on K-12 as a country, we spend about $650 billion every single year. So it's less than 1%, a little bit more than half of 1%. So for a relatively small investment, you saw this massive change of folks raising standards, of thinking differently about evaluation systems. We haven't talked about turning around chronically underperforming schools and how much courage was seen there. And we have 700,000 fewer kids in quote-unquote dropout factories. And spent some time a month ago here in San Francisco with schools that are being turned around, and just amazingly powerful stories coming from teachers and kids. So a huge amount of movement. But what I can honestly say is we've seen as much, if not more, progress in states that didn't get a nickel of our money as states that received hundreds of millions of dollars. It's fascinating to me.
And how's that work?
Someone needs to write sort of a case study. What I think we did is we created the space and the opportunity for people to act with courage and to challenge the status quo. And states had to work together. They had to come with blueprints. They had to come with plans. And what many states did is, whether or not they got the money, they moved forward with their planning. Now, yes, the money helps. But again, huge number of states who were bitterly disappointed initially, and I had some very tough calls with governors. But we've unleashed this sort of creativity and innovation and courage and given people the time and the space to move. So the lessons, I'm a much bigger believer in carrots than in sticks. You can't beat people into doing stuff. You need to incentivize. You can't make them do it. None of this is mandatory. People could apply or not apply or do whatever. But there was tremendous appetite out there, and we just sort of unleashed that. The money part was frankly the easy part. The hard part was the work at the local level. So whether it's we've done Race to Top at the state level, K-12, we've done it at the state level for early childhood. We actually want to play at the state level for higher ed and incentivize states to continue to invest. We've got big problems with college costs on the higher ed side, so we're asking for $1 billion from Congress to do that. But whether it's Race to the Top, which is state level, whether it's the I3, the Invest in Innovation, which is more the district level, or the Promised Neighborhood work at the community level. The other thing that's interesting but a little heartbreaking, on the I3 stuff, we funded 49 grants in the first round. We had 1,700 applicants. We had the greatest number of applicants in the history of our department.
1,700.
Promised Neighborhoods, we funded 10 or 12. We had 200 applicants, and we wanted to fund at least half. And so what it shows me is, again, how much hard work is going on at the local level. The pushback we get from both sides of the aisle is this is, by definition, competitive dollars. It is not formula-based. And there's some folks that say all of our money should be formula-based. 84% of our budget is formula-based, the vast majority in Title I for poor kids and IDA, and we're always going to be rock solid there. But I think we need some flexibility to invest in local communities and districts and states that are doing extraordinary work and take to scale what's working. Not everyone agrees, again, on both sides there. But again, there's so much appetite, there's so much hard work going on. When we fund a tiny percent of the very high quality applicants we're getting, it's always pretty sad to me, because again, I come from the community, worked on the other side, to not have opportunities to take to scale what folks are proving is working. That's a real missed opportunity.
Yeah.
And then the final thing I'll say, I think the lessons of Race to the Top are pretty significant for government generally. This is not an education thing. And whether it's the federal level or the state level or the local level, having more carrots, having more incentives, having more opportunities for local buy-in and matching, I think that's the business that government should be in. So I actually think there's some pretty significant lessons for what's an appropriate role for government. And folks, Governor Cuomo in New York has actually done a New York State Race to the Top and just sort of mirrored much of the stuff we were doing at the national level.
Interesting. So Maggie had mentioned the fact that really historic change in school funding has just occurred in California with our governor, who tried last year, didn't succeed, and this year he came back with a plan, which the legislature passed, part of our budget now, that will provide more funding for schools in lower income, for school districts with high proportions of lower income and English learner students. And that money, of course, really the idea for that is much along the lines that you were talking about, wanting to turn around underperforming schools, wanting to close the achievement gap. We know it's not all about money, though. What do we need to do in California to close the achievement gap?
Well, it's not a California issue, it's a national issue, so there's no unique challenge here. First, I want to say I'm really impressed with what the governor's trying to do here, and I don't know every nuance and detail, but I think he's showing real vision, real courage, and this idea of sort of more local control, but also a weighted student formula. For me, it's like common sense, but it's actually pretty revolutionary. And we had an Equity and Excellence Commission that had a bunch of great California leaders on it, and if we're serious about closing achievement gaps, to answer your question directly, we have to close what I call the opportunity gap. And anyone who thinks that it is somehow cheaper or easier to educate poor kids or disadvantaged kids or English language learners or special needs kids, money is not always the answer, but money is a piece of the answer. And if you go to any wealthy community in this country, they invest heavily in their schools. And again, I'm never going to be a proponent for investing in status quo, but when you have huge inequities in funding, again, if you look at our international comparisons, and I've spent a lot of time doing this, on a per pupil basis, we actually spend more than most countries, but we're near the bottom in terms of our lack of equity. Virtually every country spends more on their disadvantaged kids than we do. So if we're serious about, and this is all OECD data, so if folks want to look at it, look at it. But if we are serious about closing achievement gaps, we have to close opportunity gaps. I started on the early childhood piece. Again, for me, that levels the playing field for babies. But to have more resources follow kids where we know it costs more to educate them, we need to hold people accountable for results. We need to make sure outcomes are getting better. But historically in this country, we have had huge disincentives for our hardest working, our most committed teachers and principals to work in the toughest of communities, and we've had very few incentives to do that. We have to change that. This one's real personal. When I ran the Chicago Public Schools, 90% of my kids came from the minority community. 85% of my kids lived below the poverty line, and I got less than half the money of wealthier school districts just a couple miles north of me in Lake Michigan, because Illinois had such great disparities. As you guys know, most funding is local, most funding is local property taxes, and wealthier communities have higher property taxes. So I had kids that needed the most, and every single year they had less than half the money of the wealthier kids in Winnetka and Wilmette. And then you wonder over 13 years why we're not closing achievement gaps. So this is a bold, and I'm sure controversial, I'm sure there are downsides or things you have to work through, but to have a state, and a state as important as California, you educate 1 in 8 kids in this country, to have you guys step out in this space, I think is very significant for kids in this state and ultimately for what we do across the country. And I'm going to follow it very closely and be a cheerleader and do whatever we can to help. But I'm encouraged.
Thanks.
I'm encouraged.
Thank you. Well, step in the right direction is what I'm hearing from you in terms of the achievement gap. At our institute, we have one of my colleagues has been doing a lot of work, Hans Johnson, on college affordability and access, and I know that that's been an emphasis of yours and President Obama's also. What can we do to make college more affordable, increase access, improve graduation rates, all the things that we know that we need to do as a society, and we don't seem to be really doing well enough in that area?
We're not. I was talking to my friend Bob Sharman. Any good ideas you have, we need to hear them now. So let me set the context. There's some really, really encouraging trends going on around the country right now. High school graduation rates are at 3-decade highs. Most of that improvement is led from the African American Latino community, which is really important. College going rates are up significantly, particularly among Latinos. The question is, can we turn this into completion, not just access? And we have a long way to go there. One of the things I'm most proud of is we've got an additional $40 billion for Pell Grants, and Bob was just absolutely instrumental in working on this. Without going back to taxpayers for a nickel, we stopped subsidizing banks, did loans ourselves, and in 3 years we've gone from 6 million Pell recipients to 9.6 million. Many obviously first-generation college goers. So some very positive trends. Having said that, the cost of college is pretty overwhelming. And it's not just in poor communities, it's in middle-class communities. And virtually every plane I'm on, every time I go to dry cleaners, every time I go to a grocery store, people are coming up, middle-class, hardworking folks, and college is crushing them. And so we have to think about how we make college more affordable. Students are walking out with huge amounts of debt, trillion in debt out there. I worry about young people who want to start a family or buy a home or start a business, and their debt is preventing them from doing that. That has a drag on the economy. So we have a lot of hard work to do. This is not something we can do by ourselves. I talk all the time about shared responsibility. So what we've proposed in the budget is a race to the top for higher education. We haven't played in that space yet. $1 billion, and we want to incentivize three things. We want to incentivize states to reinvest in higher ed, and state cuts has been pretty decimating, and probably no place any more so than California. The government's starting to put some more money back in. But in tough economic times, 40 states cut funding to higher education. In tough economic times, 40 states did not cut funding to prisons. And I always wonder as a society where our values are, where our priorities, budgets reflect that. We have to challenge states to reinvest. We have to challenge universities to contain their costs. Some are doing that well, many aren't. We have technology and MOOCs and some really interesting things going on. We have to challenge universities to build cultures around not just access, but around completion. And that's one area where I think we have not been creative enough. We put out something like $150 billion a year in grants and loans and other things. It's all about access. It's all around inputs. None of it's around outcomes at the back end. So I mean this very seriously. Ideas of things we can do with existing resources, ideas of things we can do with potentially a race to the top, to incentivize states to get back in the game, to incentivize universities to do the right thing. This is a problem where we have done some things to help, but I'd give myself a relatively low mark so far for sort of fundamentally changing the game. So technology, 3-year degrees, speed to completion, time to completion, there's lots of things out there. We need to do, again, more, not to penalize folks. I don't think that works, but to create some incentives for some pretty radical changes in behavior.
We're going to take some questions from the audience now, but before we do, I want to ask you one other question, and that is, what's on the top of your to-do list for the, what did you describe it as, 3.5 years?
3.5 years.
Yeah. What's on your to-do list?
Lots to do.
Yeah.
So I always try to talk about the early childhood, K-12, and higher ed. So early childhood, can we double access to high-quality pre-kindergarten? Can we just literally change the game there? Not just a couple kids here and there, but
double.
Double.
Wow.
Double.
Okay.
So ambitious, expensive, but again, I would argue probably the best investment we as a country could make. Thank you. K-12, lots of progress, but again, it's going to be a hard 2 or 3 years. So for me, it's how do we stay the course? How do we implement higher standards? We have the next generation of assessments coming, which we didn't talk about. So, get away from filling the bubble tests and look at critical thinking skills and other things. We're trying to have more meaningful teacher and principal evaluation support. Lots of change in a short amount of time. Maybe in a perfect world, you'd do it over 10 or 15 years, but we don't have that luxury. And our kids can't wait. We have too many kids too far behind, 25% dropout rate in this country. We can't go slow there. So can we execute against what so many states are doing on the K-12 side? And then we talk about higher ed. How do we continue to make higher ed much more accessible and affordable? And how do we drive up completion rates? At the end of the day, the president has challenged me and all of us to again lead the world in college graduation rates by 2020. One generation ago, we were first. Today, we're 14th. And for me, it's about a lot more than education. We're fighting for our country's economic competitiveness here. So lots of pieces to get there, but that's the North Star, and that's how I want to be held accountable.
That's a great to-do list, and since you're speeding up the game as you described it as you go along, you got 3.5 years, so fantastic. Let's take a few questions from the audience.
I'm Susan Solomon. I'm Executive Vice President of United Educators of San Francisco. And I was interested in what you said about the disincentives to work in our most challenging schools, and your example was funding, and I absolutely agree. However, in terms of teacher evaluation, and I would like to
Can
point...
I just
Yes.
first of all say question?
This is a question.
Okay, but short
In
question.
teacher evaluations, what is the incentive to stay in a challenging school if an evaluation is going to be linked to student test scores?
Thank you.
Great question. Let me be really clear, because I think there's a huge misconception I'd like to clear up. I always say there should be a piece of the evaluation, but I want to look at what teachers are doing in that school compared to other teachers working with similar populations. So it's apples to apples. So if you're working in a high minority school, or high poverty school, or high ELL school, or high special ed school, how are you doing relative to your colleagues in the district or the state or whatever it might be? And what I think we fail to have the courage to talk about is give me the poorest school in the toughest neighborhood. Fantastic teaching is rapidly increasing student achievement. Now, you may not hit on an absolute score where the gifted kids are, but I always, if your kids come to you 3 grade levels behind and leave you a grade level behind, that's an amazing job of teaching going on there. So if it's apples to apples, poor kids versus poor kids, EL versus ELL, there are still huge ranges in what kids are learning. And we haven't talked about that openly and honestly. And again, I saw it in Chicago where I saw poor schools where we had very few kids being successful, and we had other schools where we had 95, 96% graduation rates and 95% of those going on to college in identically tough, challenging, frankly, very violent communities. And to act like all these kids can't be successful. I was going to turn around. What was the school we were at, Richard?
Everett Middle School.
Everett Middle School. Supposedly one of the worst schools, not in San Francisco, but in the state. Turned it around 3 years ago. New principal, new teachers, new energy. Data's off the charts. Fastest improving school, I think, in the state, maybe, or definitely in the city. Talked to an 8th grader who was in 6th grade when that school was turned around, and she said she was terrified to go to school. She was terrified to go to school because it was so violent. And think about what kind of climate that is. And now it's fastest improving school. So what I would argue, again, where you're seeing huge improvements, pay those teachers a lot more, double salaries, principals a lot more to go in and work in those communities, and give them a reason to take on the toughest of assignments. We never do that. Build a sort of a culture where that's the badge of honor. The analogy I always give is when the president wanted to go after Osama bin Laden, he didn't send in a bunch of rookies or people just in boot camp. Who did he send? He sent the Navy SEALs. Sent the best of the best. And if we're serious about changing outcomes, whether it's in the inner city or in rural areas or remote areas, we need to send the best of the best. And it is hard work. It's not for the faint of heart. But where you have a team, and anyone who hasn't been there, I'd encourage, go talk to the staff at Everett Middle School. Go talk to the kids there. Data is amazing, but the personal stories are so compelling. And I want to make that the norm. I want to make that the badge of honor. You prove you're an amazing educator, then you go work in the tough community. We need to do everything we can to support it. One last sort of heartbreaking story is I visit Native American reservations. I was on one Native American reservation where they literally can't recruit teachers from this country. Half the teachers come from the Philippines because they can't get a United States teacher to teach there. Then we wonder why we have devastating achievement gaps in our Native community. We need to value those children and figure out how we create a support structure of teams and a lot more dollars and housing and whatever it takes to get great educators to go work in our Native communities.
Other questions? Yes, over here. And I'm sorry, Susan, for asking for a short question, but I'm looking at the time and want to try to get as many questions as we possibly can. We're actually at 7 now, so.
Hi, Secretary Duncan. Thank you so much for coming. I taught in a really high poverty school in the Bronx, and I just want to thank you for all of the work that you're doing on behalf of kids like that. And I just want to ask you, I had kids who couldn't see the board because they couldn't afford eyeglasses. Yeah. And can you say more about what you're doing to address high poverty schools? Like, do you support community schools, and what types of things are you doing in that area?
So I'm maybe the biggest supporter of community schools. One of the things I was most proud in Chicago is we had 150 community schools. And great teachers, great principals make a huge difference, but they can't do it by themselves. So where you have to feed 3 meals a day, you need to feed 3 meals a day. And if kids are hungry, it's hard to concentrate. We had a couple thousand kids in Chicago. We very quietly and discreetly sent them home with backpacks full of food on Friday afternoons because we worried about them not eating over the weekends. We did tens of thousands of eyeglasses. We did tens of thousands of dental exams. And if you have, cavities and gum disease, it's hard to concentrate. So we had 36 schools that had healthcare clinics attached to the schools. And those were not just helping keep kids in school. We had kids who were suicidal and dealing with crazy stuff. It's helping keep some of our kids alive. And so we need to get, it's not either or. People say, great educators or, it's both and. For me, it's foundational. Kids' physical, social, and emotional needs, we have to meet them. That's And then we can talk about AP calculus and biology and physics. If kids are hungry, if they're scared, if they're being bullied, if they're not safe, they can't see the blackboard, we're kidding ourselves. We're speaking a different language. And so schools need to do this. Schools can't do this by themselves. Nonprofits, social service agencies, healthcare clinics. We have 100,000 schools in this country, 100,000. Rich neighborhoods, poor neighborhoods, black, white, Latino. Every school has classrooms. They have computer labs. They have libraries. They have gyms. Some have pools. They don't belong to me or to the superintendent or to the principal. They belong to the community. And we should have them open 12, 13, 14 hours a day and have the school run them 9 to 3 and have the community run it 3 o'clock to 9 o'clock and serve dinner and mentoring and counseling and GED and ESL and family literacy nights. I had some schools in Chicago in very, very tough communities where I had 150 parents coming every day for their own education. And I promise you, where that was happening, where that school was the center of the neighborhood, those kids are going to be just fine. Tough economic times, I keep telling the Boys and Girls Clubs and the Wides, stop building buildings. Don't put your money into bricks and mortar. We should give you the building, give it to you for $1, don't charge a bunch of rent, but put all your money into academic enrichment and support. And again, if you want to incentivize teachers to go work in tough communities, that's a huge incentive for teachers to go work in tough communities if they have those support services there. They feel they're fighting the battle by themselves, that's a pretty tough challenge.
Question on this side of the room, right over here. Becky?
Thank you. I'm Becky Morgan, friend of your deputy, Martha Cantor. So say
She's
hello.
good people.
Yeah, she's great. You started one of your early comments about the parents in South Korea. An idea that I and a friend that is here with me who has a foundation called Bring Me a Book, and I run our family foundation, is looking at could we put together book packets with some instructions on the value of reading and the bonding between parent and child at the hospital before the mother ever leaves the hospital with the baby. Is there, putting the health department and the education department together, is there any hope of getting support for doing something like that?
We should absolutely be doing that, and frankly, that's a great idea, but it's honestly a start. Part of what we want to do with this early childhood, this 0 to 5 proposal, we want to do a lot more home visiting that HHS would do. Parents, every parent wants the best for their kid. Not every parent knows how to help their child learn and how to speak to them and the importance of vocabulary and words. So sending home packets of books, doing home visits. Again, not every parent needs home visits, but we know the parents that are at risk, single moms or teenage moms or whatever it might be. We know who needs help. And so if we're, again, serious about closing what I call the opportunity gap, the 0 to 5 space, we need to be much more intentional, much more thoughtful. Schools, health, hospitals, the community, nonprofits, churches, faith-based institutions. As a community, we have far too many kids falling through the cracks. And people talk about the difference in words and whatever, 3 million words, or 30 million words, I think it is, fewer words heard, middle class versus a low-income family. And then we wonder why these kids struggle. We're not, again, as a country, we're not serious. So I'd strongly encourage you to pursue that. And the more comprehensive we can be in intensive, clear intervention for our babies and for their families, yes, it costs something. The long-term dividends are pretty extraordinary.
So I'm going to take one more question from this side of the room because we're into another basketball analogy. We're in overtime
All right.
here, over past 7 o'clock. So.
Thank you, Secretary Duncan. My name is Londa Ajose. I'm with California Competes, and I really appreciate your comments around moving the needle towards academic success for post-secondary education. And I'm wondering what you think about performance-based funding, in part because Governor Brown this year has flirted with the idea of holding the colleges accountable by having them account for particular kinds of variables and measures, and I'm wondering if you think that's a strategy.
I think it's important in some states to move it there, and it goes very much to the question of that the woman here asked about performance-based pay for teachers. It's going to be really clear. I want to look at apples versus apples, growth versus gain. So I like the idea, but you could set up the program very poorly. And if you do it just upon absolute completion rates, you actually create a disincentive to enroll first-generation college goers and Pell Grant recipients. So what you want to look at, again, is measure apples to apples. Look at Pell Grant recipients versus Pell Grant recipients. Look at first-generation college goers versus first-generation college goers. And again, across a system as large as California's, I promise you, you'll see huge disparities. and incentivizing people to take the most at-risk college students, but also see them through, that's exactly how we should do it. So you have states, Tennessee's looking at this, Missouri's looking at this, so there's some models out there folks can look at. It's early on, but again, historically, all of us, at the federal level, states, all of the money has been based upon inputs, nothing on outcomes. And I think there's a balance there you need to look at, but creating the right incentive structure. If you don't do it perfectly, having the courage to say we didn't do it perfectly and move on. But again, incentivizing folks to take on children or young people who are at risk and then help them complete, that's what we need to do. Last thing, when I was in Chicago, we had kids with basically identical GPAs, identical test scores going to different local universities. Some were graduating like 80% and some at like 22%. Wildly, wildly different outcomes with very similar inputs. So we started just ourselves, frankly, steering kids towards certain universities and away from others. We had to do it as the right thing to do, but we shouldn't have to do that. Folks should be helping us do this. And what do you want to do? You want to change behavior. You want to have everybody take these kids' success seriously, and you want more young people to go to universities who take their completion rates seriously. When we tried to put in the FAFSA form what graduation rates were from colleges, we had a number of universities push back on that, just knowing what the graduation rate was. That's pretty basic transparency. We need to be going way beyond that. If we can't hand it up, and again, I want to know, if your graduation rate is 30%, if you're going to 32 to 35 to 40, it's not where we want to be, but you're making progress. But if you're going from 40 to 37 to 35, then we need to talk. And so having some resources, having money, incentives, plus transparency, I think can change behavior in a pretty profound way.
Secretary Duncan, it's been an honor and a privilege to have you here today. I think you sense the energy and enthusiasm in this room about education issues from the pre-K up to the K through 12 and higher education levels. You are the first cabinet secretary to be here as part of our speaker series, and I just really appreciate so much that you took the time.
I'll recommend it to my friends. You do a great
please
job.
Please do. Thank you. Please do.
Yeah.
And Donna, thank you very much, and Maggie, excellent summary of where we are in education. And for all of you here tonight, thank you for taking your time on a Friday afternoon.
You got to find something better to do.
We've got, but you know, you don't get moments like this very often where you have somebody like Secretary Duncan and all of his experience, both at the local level and at the federal level in education, and really just delighted to hear all the work that you're doing in Washington, and the best of luck to you. And for everyone, we have a reception that will follow this, more food, and hopefully more conversation. And please fill out your evaluation forms, and please join us at our next speaking engagement too. So thanks very much. Thank you.